Hello and welcome to Stupid Ancient History with, well, just Midgley today. In a slight change to our normal shenanigans, rather than looking at the story and the narrative and the content of Cleopatra, we're going to look at 5-mark source questions that you'll find on the depth study paper. It's less fun to look at exam technique, you can't get as many gags out of it, but we'll do our best to make it as painless as possible. And before we dig into the actual source questions themselves, we should point out all the materials and resources that I'm going to use in this little video are from the OCR specimen assessment materials. These are all readily available on OCR's website, so you don't need to have to worry about whether you have access to OCR's secure online papers, whether you can find these things or not. We've gone for the most straightforward, easy to find resources you can. So broadly today we're going to look at some general techniques, some tips and ideas. We're going to look at how to answer these questions and try and keep it as straightforward as possible, and then have a look at some of the sample answers and the examiner commentary that OCR have posted online. Now this is specifically focused on Cleopatra, but the technique and everything we're going to look at is ultimately the same for any of the depth studies and will be equally applicable to the likes of Alexander the Great, life in Roman Britain, Hannibal, whichever depth study you are studying. So before we crack on, we should probably give out a few disclaimers just to cover ourselves. So the first one is the tips and techniques, what I'm going to talk through now. These are things that I have found useful in the past and students have found useful in the past when trying to tackle exam technique, keeping it simple, keeping it straightforward. This is not the only way to do it. If you have a better way of doing it or a different way of doing it, or you've been taught another way to do it, happy days. Anyone who's worked with OCR for any amount of time will know they do not like pigeonholing or straitjacketing people into specific structures. They like vague mark schemes. So this is just simply things my students have found useful in the past. Again, another disclaimer, the sample responses and examiners' comments are from OCR. They are nothing really to do with me. I did not write them, I did not mark them, I did not generate them. I'm simply working with what we have to work with. So with all that aside, let's now start looking at these source questions. So the specific source questions are both worth 5 marks each, and they are the first real questions you see after the quick knowledge questions that are common in all sections of the exam paper. They are, as you can see, they are the only questions in the depth study with a given specific source. There are 2 questions tied to this source and they follow a typical formula. First question is often a kind of what can we learn about question. It's usually phrased along those lines. The second question is almost universally how reliable is the passage. So our first top tip before we even start looking at the nuances of these questions, and this seems a bit contrary to what some people teach, but I've found this really useful, is first tip to do is read the questions before you read the source. It would be nicer if the questions came above the source, but this is what we work with. The reason why it's a good idea to read the questions before you read the source is that when you go to read the source, you know what you are looking for, you know what the issue is. So in this example, the question is about the Battle of Actium. You know straight away what you're looking for, and it will kick your brain into that kind of retrieval mode where you instinctively, rather than just reading it going, oh that's nice, you're looking to extract things. The reason that this is really useful is you do not have time in this exam to do things twice. A real key to success when you're coming towards the final stages of preparing for the exam is this idea of shaving minutes. You've got an awful lot to write about in an hour and 45 minutes, 2 full sections, and with the big questions at the end. So to this purpose, the more time you can save on the shorter, quicker questions, the more time you'll have to properly plan and think about the essay questions at the end. So given that these 2 questions are both worth 5 marks, realistically you need to be spending no more than 10 minutes on both of these questions. That's 5 minutes apiece. If you can shrink it down, if you can shave it down to 4 minutes, 3.5 minutes, and still crack out a good response, you will be putting yourself in a much better position for the bigger questions that come later. So first, let's have a look at the source and the question 12 that comes with it. If you're not using a copy of the source in front of you and you're just using this video, it might be a good idea now just to pause it, read the source so you know what you're talking about. So here we see we've got a little gobbet of a source. It's a great word that they use to refer to this length of source. It's quite brief, it's to the point, and the source is about the Battle of Actium, and the author is Paterculus. So like we said before, read the questions before you read the source. Not only will it help you start looking, it'll help you start specifically looking for the things you're going to write about in the source, but hopefully once you read things like the Battle of Actium and Paterculus, this will kick your brain into retrieving all the things you know about the Battle of Actium, all the stuff that happens around it, who Paterculus is, and it will warm your brain up to make answering this question a bit easier. It'll make analysis easier if your brain's already thinking about what else you know that goes almost around the edges of this source. So if we look at the general nuts and bolts of what question 12 asks for, or the first of the 5 mark source questions asks for, largely it's about extracting information. It's not quite comprehension, but that's a basis of it. Basically, do you know what's happened? Do you know what's going on in the source? Can you work out where it fits in the narrative, and does it make sense to you? Relatively straightforward, extracting information and saying, yes, it tells us this. But for the higher bands, certainly, as well as just picking out what you can see, we should be making a comment about it, an intelligent comment ideally, something along the lines of how it fits into the broader scheme of things. It will become clearer once we look at the actual question, but what can you see, what's going on, what judgment or what can you say about it? Now, again, this is just a general tip, it's not a solid cast iron way of smashing this question, but a general quick tip or rule of thumb is try, for these kind of questions, try and aim for at least 3 points. You may find more than 3 points, but arguably if you can make 3 points from the source, even if you're just picking out 3 things that happen, you're going to start off with a relatively sturdy basis to move on. And if you're picking out 3 things from the source, arguably you would get 3 marks. But there's something else that hopefully you can see in the source where I've highlighted the ellipses. Now the ellipses are your friend. Obviously this is not the total extent of Paterculus' work or the full extent of his coverage of the Battle of Actium. So what these ellipses mean is the exam board have deliberately chopped out pieces of the wider source, and they've done that just for you. So you don't have to read through vast amounts of things, but also you know that anything after the ellipsis or on either side of it, that's been deliberately put in this source question so there's something valuable or useful for you to write about. So if you see an ellipsis in your source, brilliant, use them as a roadmap. Think, have I included something before it? Have I included something after it? In this case, unusually, there's 2, so it almost breaks down the source into 3 distinct chunks for you to help you in these quick time conditions to find what the good bits are and skip right through for the dreck. And so we get to picking apart the source properly. Now, as you will see, there's an awful lot going on in this source, and the little gobbets that OCR will put in the exam papers will hopefully have lots of useful, juicy stuff that you can comment on. It shouldn't, fingers crossed, touch wood, pray to whichever gods you pray to, it shouldn't be some random passage that seems to have nothing to do with anything. So the first thing I would talk about, you'll see I've highlighted various parts of this, first thing I would comment about in my answer would be this initial depiction. Again, Paterculus is not subtle. He calls it the greatest battle. The day of the greatest battle arrived. He points out that the battle is taking place at sea, so Caesar and Antony led out their fleets to fight. And we, just in case we missed the subtle point earlier, we've got this very clear description of that one is to save the world and one is out to destroy it. Even though Paterculus doesn't name who's on which side, it's pretty clear from everything we know who's out to save the world, Octavian, and who's out to destroy it, Antony. Probably from what we've seen of him on a drunken bender. The next point I've highlighted, if you just have a look for the next bit of highlighting, is the mismatch of forces. According to this, it seems that Octavian is much better prepared. It says he has generals, rowers and soldiers. The other had nothing except soldiers. Obviously, you could now use your own knowledge here to go, ooh, hang on, didn't Mark Antony have a much larger fleet initially? So you could, this is the bit about your brain working already, thinking, oh, hang on, that's a bit different to what I've seen. And then the next bits I've highlighted are the obvious points. Cleopatra flees, so does Antony. Antony's men continue to fight. So we've got a bit of straightforward narrative that we can then build on to say, look, this tells us usefully what is happening. So the battle is fought at sea. We're told one force is much bigger than the other. We're told straight away Cleopatra flees, quickly followed by Mark Antony, and he leaves his men to fight without him. So it's almost as if from the start the forces of good, which are Octavian, we're always going to triumph over Antony because he's weak, he runs off, he's being corrupted and manipulated by Cleopatra. But Paterculus then is very clear to say, look, his men fought bravely, so he puts all the blame squarely on Antony and Cleopatra. So once we've picked out what we want to write about, all our little gobbets, our little bits from the source, we need to start thinking about how you actually put it together. I would always suggest starting your answer by doing one of two things, or combining two things. Try and rephrase the question, but do it so you're almost making a judgment. So rather than the question being, what can we learn from the source? Start with, we can learn X amount from the source, or we can learn quite a lot from the source about the Battle of Actium. When you're making your point, ideally, you should be using little snippet quotes in your answer. If they've given you a source, use it. It's there to help you. Don't try and rephrase or rewrite works of these ancient authors. They've been around for a couple of thousand years because they knew how to turn a good phrase. Use it, stick it in. We're not looking for full sentence quotes at all. You just do not have the time. Just key little bits, so almost the bits you've highlighted. If I was to write this, I would start by do my little brief statement of introduction, my brief judgment, make my factual points, so these are the things I've found about it, and then I would try and make my intelligent comment almost like a conclusion. You don't have to put it at the end at all. You could very well with this talk about your knowledge and the mismatch, or talk about the importance of Augustus, or the fact that it was a controversial decision to fight at the sea for Antony because of Cleopatra, or the comments about Cleopatra. But ideally, if you are struggling, and don't forget in the exam, by this time you'll have already written a whole section on the rise of Rome, I'd probably stick with the simple idea of make your factual points and then make your intelligent comment. If your brain is that done in that you can't think of anything intelligent, at least you've made your 3 points. And again, don't forget, don't spend too long. You do not have time to sit and ponder and create a grand masterpiece for 5 marks. It's just not worth it. So let's now have a look at everyone's favourite document, also known as the vaguest thing written in the history of humanity, the Marx Key. So if you look at what's on your screen now, you'll see that I've blanked out the indicative content because this will change from question to question, and for the purposes of what we're looking at, we're not really looking at indicative content, it's what was in the source. You'll also see we've highlighted key parts of the Marx scheme, so what it's asking for. Obviously, the AO3 part says use, analyse and evaluate the sources. That should not be a surprise for a source-based question. What it does want you to do, what it does keep suggesting is you do need to use details from the source. You cannot just write about the Battle of Actium without referencing the source. The AO3 is entirely about using the source, so you've got to. Again, you can push that mark slightly by giving a more detailed response by giving the quotes. Full range of appropriate details. Use the quotes. The next bit we've highlighted is characteristics. So this is again moving into the higher level answers, where you're not just making a list of stuff that happened. Obviously, it's a prose response. You cannot just bullet point, this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Not if you want to gain any more than a few marks. So you've got to talk about what happened, but how it's characterised, how it's portrayed. With this extract from the Battle of Actium, it's dead simple. It's all Augustus is great, Antony's a doofus. It was only ever going to go one way. And again, the emphasis where it says sophisticated evaluation of what we can learn. This is about that opening comment, that opening statement. From the source, we can learn a significant amount or a limited amount. You're almost making your conclusionary statements straight away and then simply proving it with what you're writing next. So there it is. There is the mark scheme. Try and stick to these simple formulas rather than stressing about mark schemes, because the mark schemes, as you can see, are quite broad and quite vague because there are so many different responses you could give. So super quickly, in this next section, we're going to look at some sample answers from OCR for question 12. If you're quite happy with how to do this kind of question and you just want to have a go at it yourself, feel free to skip on to the next section where we look at question 13. But here we go with some sample answers from OCR. So here's example 1. Obviously you've got the sample response at the top in this nice little beigey coloured box, and an examiner commentary below with the mark. Now, again, pause it, have a quick read, but I'm just going to talk about the initial points I would make about this. Example 1 is fine to some extent. It's a good example of using the 3 points from the source as quickly as you can to gain some marks. This person absolutely has picked out 3 details of what happened in the source. They've not listed it as bullet points, but they've pretty much said Paterculus is writing about the Battle of Actium, where Octavian has everything, Antony had nothing. Cleopatra leaves, Antony legs it after her, the army don't give up. So effectively they're paraphrasing what is in the source, but they've picked out some of the key details, and there's a little bit of contextualization going on where he talks about Octavian and Antony, and whoever wrote this response clearly knows who had lots and who had little. They can read, they're not just picking out 3 things from the source, but this is a good example of that very perfunctory, quick fire, 3 things from the source, move on. 3 marks out of 5 in the grand scheme of things is not a bad answer. It's not, if you're consistently hitting this mark, you're not going to get the 9s, but you will do reasonably well. So on to our second example now. Straight away you can see, simply by the volume of what has been written, this is going to be a more substantial answer. I'm not saying you've got to write tons for this kind of response, but you need to include some detail, you need to show some specificity. So straight away from the very start we see some contextualization and a comment. We can see that they've used their own knowledge to make the comment that the decision to fight at sea rather than land was a controversial decision. They don't need to go on any further and say that it was Cleopatra's choice rather than Antony's, and it played to Octavian's strength rather than Antony's. They don't need that. They're just pointing out it's controversial. All the way through as well, you should be able to see that they've peppered their answer with these kind of mini quotes, even to the idea of only one word as a quote. They're using the actual source and the detail of the source throughout to emphasize and illustrate their answer. So their level of detail and recall from the source is significantly better. And again, with this, they make a comment about the characteristics, or one of the key characteristics of the battle. There's a lot of emphasis here on the idea of Antony's betrayal. He flees and his men stay and fight. So while it's not explicit and we're not necessarily talking about the reliability of the source, this candidate is saying it's characteristic in this source that Antony is the one who let his men down. There's no mention of Octavian leading gloriously, but there's a clear finger pointing at Antony, and that is characteristic of this source. So now we should look really at question 13, and this is the inevitable how reliable question. You're never going to get any ancient history exam paper or any reference to ancient authors without some question about their reliability or their credibility. Now, to do this requires ideally for you to refer directly to the source itself, and there will always be something in the source that you can comment on and pick up on. But also, really what they're looking for as well is some idea of the context or detail about the author. Do you know who wrote this and how that can be used to evaluate how reliable they are? Do you know who was writing it, what they thought about things? And hopefully you will have studied this for your depth source. You will know about Paterculus, you will know about Plutarch, you will know about the various different authors. And now is the time to pick out these kind of things. But, and this is really kind of the sticking point where some people think they've done it, but they haven't. Where you are talking about the context of the author and who they are, it's got to be relevant to what the question is asking or what they're writing about. You know, you can't just chuck in the fact that Paterculus had a pet cat called Fluffy and hope that that counts as context. It doesn't. It's pointless. It's irrelevant, and also clearly not true. But the point is, you can't just talk about who this guy was and when he was born, because no one cares unless you directly apply it to the source. And we'll look at some good examples later on, but ultimately, if it's Paterculus or one of these near primary sources, you'd be looking at their writing to glorify Octavian, Antony's the bad guy, and so on. So you look at when they're writing and why they're doing. So let's have a bit more of a close look at this source and this question and see what we can say about how reliable do we think this source is. So, like the previous question, a general rule of thumb, a good guideline, would be to aim for, try and write a minimum of 3 points. Again, it's not a golden rule, it's just a good idea. Hopefully, like we've mentioned before, there will be plenty in the source for you to pick up on. OCR choose these sources quite carefully. They are there to be your friends. Hopefully, with any degree of prior knowledge and intelligence, you should be able to go to town on this. Again, look for the ellipses. These may not just have been included for the content, but it may be that there's something golden after one of these ellipses. And if you look at the source, happy days, there's a beautiful, perfect example of the kind of thing that you'll love to throw in. You'll see there's a little bit that's outlined in red where Paterculus says, "to be honest." This is the kind of golden hook that we're looking for. Anything where the author gives an opinion, or they throw shade on their own sources, or they give a different version of events, or they use phrases like "some people say" or "some sources suggest." Anything where they are themselves almost destabilizing the credibility and objectivity of what they're writing, go to town on that. Here, to be honest, the soldiers, this is Paterculus putting his perspective in, which instantly we could use to say this makes it less reliable because clearly the author has an invested interest in what he's writing. Now, if you look at the source on the screen, you'll see that yes, I've highlighted it in 2 colours. That's purely for the purpose of this little video. The green highlighting is to do with question 13, the yellow highlighting is from the previous one in year 12. In the exam, you do not have time to faff around getting out different highlighter pens and different colours. Yes, it may help you differentiate between the 2 things you want to write about, but you just don't have time. If need be, come up with your own little code. Do a straight underline for question 12 and a wavy underline for anything to do with reliability, but make sure it's quick and perfunctory. Don't spend longer colouring in the source than you're actually going to have to write about it. You know? Again, if you look at the way this has been highlighted, some bits are highlighted in green and yellow. So the idea of doing 2 different colours or different keys, it's going to be useful, but not if that becomes the focus of what you're doing. When you approach the paper, you need to make sure that you're reading it, highlighting it, to be useful rather than that being the main object of the activity. But certainly if you're reading it through once, it's probably a good idea to write, highlight, annotate, just so when you get to question 13 you can look straight back and go, right, they're the bits I want to write for this, but don't colour it in. It's not a geography exam. So now hopefully you've had a little read of the highlighted parts of the source. If you haven't, again, I'd suggest you pause it, have a quick read. And now we need to look at, well, what would we write? How would we respond to the idea of reliability? And let's start with the source, the content of the source. It should be pretty clear to anyone who's got any idea about this, or even if you haven't, this is an obvious hatchet job. From the start, it's Octavian who's saving the world, and Antony and Cleopatra are there to destroy it. You know, it's clearly pro-Octavian, pro-Augustan. So that's the first thing we could definitely throw in about this idea of, is it reliable? And if we throw that point in, and without wanting to make too many bold statements, if it's anything in the exam that relates to Antony and Cleopatra and Octavian, Octavian is always going to be written up as the better of the 3. So if we make this point, you're going to find a lot of evidence or a lot of things that you can use to support this. So we said Octavian saving the world, Antony and Cleo are out to destroy it. Straight after that, we get this emphasis on Cleopatra running first. So straight away, the Paterculus is saying Cleopatra is the first to run, even though we know, and we can throw this in to help push this argument, that it's actually Cleopatra who's keen for this battle to happen at sea, or arguably for this battle to happen. You know? Straight away following that, if that's not enough, Antony is described not directly as a coward, but then he's the guy who legs it next. He's a deserter, and then we get this big description of he's the man who should be punishing deserters, but he does it himself, so he should be punishing himself, or it's worse that he does it. He's meant to be the general. In direct contrast to these two, so being very clear now to put all of the blame personally on these 2 individuals and not the loyal soldiers who followed them, we have a nice description of the bravery of Antony's men. Not Antony at all. His men who, even though they know they're not going to win, they continue fighting for, almost for their honour. And to, again, furthering the point that Antony and Cleopatra just throw away all honour. They've caused this conflict, they've led to this war, but now they're having none of it, and they're off. And just in case, the cherry on the top, just in case the source wasn't really obvious enough, the very last line blames Cleopatra. Again, it says, Cleopatra wished, since it was her decision which had led him to flee. So he's calling Antony a coward, but he's also saying, look, it's Cleopatra's fault. So hopefully you can see from that there's definitely more than 3 things you could write about the content of the source. If you don't have to write about all of them, you could make the point about it being pro-Octavian and anti-Antony. There's a mouthful. and use those as illustrations. If we want to use some context though, hopefully this is where you dig out your knowledge of Paterculus and making it appropriate to the source. This is where we'd say things like, Paterculus is writing largely under Tiberius, who's the emperor after Augustus, and this is a point where Augustus has been deified. So it's going to be really, really hard for Paterculus to criticise the actions of Octavian, who then becomes Augustus. We can also throw in that Paterculus as well, to get to where he was, he spent a lot of time flattering the imperial family. We could throw in details like he has military experience. Rather than just leaving at that though, we need to say he's got military experience, so he's going to be pretty good, he's going to be quite adept at recording military engagements. He will understand strategy, he will understand battles, so he comes at the recording of the Battle of Actium with a kind of insider's view of military operations. We could suggest, this could be kind of pro-Augustan propaganda. We know Paterculus is writing after the event and after Augustus largely, so we should be able to point out that to some extent a lot of the material Paterculus will have been able to access, a lot of the records of the battle, a lot of the popular depictions of the battle, Horace, Ovid, Virgil particularly, are very, very pro-Augustan. So that's going to make it very hard for Paterculus, or particularly Plutarch later on, it's going to be very hard for these guys to gain an objective view of the events. If all the sources say Antony was a doofus and Octavian was great, they can't make their sources up. But we've got to be quite careful about saying this is we definitely know this. Again, if you want to go for the super top level and for 5 marks, only do this really if you know your sources inside out. Don't guess, because you'll just look daft. Can you compare it, not in any great detail, can you compare it to other sources? So does Plutarch write a different account to the Battle of Actium? Does Virgil write a different account to the Battle of Actium? In both those cases the answer is yes, although some of it is quite subtle. Plutarch is more balanced, Virgil is certainly more pro-Augustan. You should also point out, when we talk about AO3 and reliability, the obvious point to go to is, no, it's rubbish, it's not reliable, look at all these reasons why. It's perfectly valid, however, to say, well, it is largely accurate. This is reliable to some extent. It is useful. We know from other sources that the events, as he described, are accurate. We know Cleopatra legs it first, we know Antony follows her, and we know Octavian and Marcus Agrippa make short work of their remaining forces. The other thing we could also say is, well, of all the accounts of the Battle of Actium, Paterculus is one of the most complete and accurate surviving sources. Surviving being a key point for ancient history, because again, these things have lasted for 2,000 years. If we think about the vast majority, the amount of material that's been lost to time, yes, there may well have been a more accurate depiction somewhere out there, but we've lost it. Bit careless, but that's what happens with history. So don't be afraid to say the positive aspects about the reliability of the source. So to quickly recap and review the general points for this kind of reliability question, they're dead straightforward. Pick your points or themes from the source, ideally more than one, or make it a big one with lots of support. Remember, the source will have something juicy you can pick up on. If you can, try and spot anywhere where the historians include their opinions, where they're throwing shade on their sources, if there's anything obviously missing, if they're giving 2 different versions of accounts, or they're admitting they don't know. These kind of things are always useful. Once you've got your key bits from the source that you're going to write about, then think about what wider knowledge, what contextual knowledge about the author and how and why they're writing can you put in to try and explain why is reliable or why it isn't reliable. Don't forget, AO3 can work both ways. No source is perfect. Some are more reliable than others. There's no reason why you can't say Paterculus is probably more reliable than Virgil because blah 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 blah, but less reliable than Plutarch because blah 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 blah. Remember, this 3-point idea is not the only way to do it. This is just what I've found to work in the past, and if you've got a different way of doing it, happy days. And following the same structure, we're back to the Marx scheme. So it is relatively straightforward, if not vague. We've we've highlighted some of the key bits, and again, the Marx scheme refers to using the source or the content. So they don't mind if you just use one or the other, but I would suggest ideally use both. One will lead to the other. Using the source is possibly more straightforward because it's there, it's in front of you, but I would ideally do a bit of both. They will feed into each other. A key thing to think about is this idea of portrayal of characters. When it comes to Cleopatra, it's dead easy. She's portrayed continually in one way. Mark Antony the same, and Octavian again always comes out with the upper hand. The other thing that it talks about is a convincing conclusion. Now, you don't necessarily need to write a conclusion in this, and when we look at some of the answers from OCR, we'll see that. It's more about making a judgment, and you can do that in your very first sentence, and then develop it with examples. Something like, using passage C, we can see that the account is largely reliable. It talks about the events, blah, 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 blah. However, it's a clear hatchet job, or vice versa. So it's all about thinking about that first sentence and what you're going to write. And just with the previous question, let's have a quick look at some samples from OCR dealing with this question particularly. Again, all these materials are available on the OCR Ancient History GCSE webpage, so you shouldn't really have any problem getting extra copies of these to look at. So here's example 1. Again, if you want to pause and quickly read it, do so, that's fine. Now, example 1 has some real obvious problems, and these come up quite a lot either through panic or not knowing what you're talking about. So the first thing that is wrong with this answer is that there is no reference to the source. There is no use of the source. The comments they're actually making about the author as well could be about anyone. The ancient historian may have exaggerated the situation to make it less reliable. Well, are they talking about Paterculus or Herodotus? You know, it's too generic, it's too vague, and then it does one of my most hated things, and they deserve to be fired out of a catapult for writing this. This particular line of, this historian was not reliable because they lived after the event, so they don't know because they weren't there. Yeah, we know. That's what historians do. If they're there at the time, they're a journalist. Historians generally do not live through the events they are writing about. That's the whole point of it. Yes, there are some exceptions, but generally, please don't write, oh, the historian wasn't there, so how would they know? How would they know? Do they possibly research things, read things? It's just a redundant comment, and you're never going to get any marks for it. Even though this one sort of suggests he could have heard the story from someone else and wrote it exaggerating the facts, it's too vague. It just almost flagged up that you're struggling, you have no idea, and you're just writing the first thing that comes into your head. Please don't do it. Example 2, however, this one on the screen, again I would advise you pause it, have a quick read of it. This is a much higher level. It's got this balance of source and context. Again, look at how it's crafting it. It's using particular phrases, little quotes that really emphasize the point they're trying to make. It talks about Paterculus, and it does talk about how it's described. Again, look at the opening statement. It makes a judgment. In my opinion, these accounts are fairly accurate. Brilliant. And then they go on to talk about why it is, but also why it isn't. If you look in the examiner commentary, it gives some very specific things about how it could be improved. Again, these are not universal. So when it says other sources, rather than referencing Plutarch, who we know is more balanced, you don't necessarily, I don't want you to go away and panic and think, oh my god, I've got to know the difference between every single source and every little nuance. Yes, that would be brilliant if you could, but it's unrealistic to expect that in an exam. The general tip or hack around this, though, would be for most of your depth studies, you have a main source. So for Cleopatra, our main source is Plutarch. If you're doing Alexander the Great, we've got two main sources, Arrian and Plutarch. And if you see that the source that crops up is from someone other than them, there's a fair chance you could suggest that there are similarities but slight differences between the two sources. You've got to be careful though, you've got to know what each source broadly writes about. So you can't, if it's about Cleopatra, you can't say, oh, Horace writes about Cleopatra's early years in Egypt, because we know he doesn't, he just writes about Actium. But in terms of looking at those more sophisticated comparisons, it is possible with a degree of common sense and a reasonably secure knowledge of what the sources are writing about to do these comparisons. But yeah, this is a 4 out of 5 mark question. It's got very specific detail, and hopefully you can see clearly the difference between this and the previous one. And finally, now we've got a third example. Now, I've included this one not because it does anything particularly radically different, but it highlights another common problem. This is a good attempt to try and balance source and context. It's heavy on the context, but it tries to do both. Now, the big issue here, and it picks it up in the exam commentary, is that it is too blunt. This answer suggests that Augustus controls all the writers. Like he is the ultimate copyright editor. He controls what everyone says on pain of death. I mean, Augustus was a man in charge, but he was no Stalin. Don't forget, he was in charge, but to expect that level of creative control even after his death is a bit too blunt. And this is why this answer has been limited at 3 out of 5 marks. It's too blunt an assessment to say Augustus controlled all the histories. He didn't. He will have had influence, absolutely, and historians probably and writers would have got further in life had they flattered Augustus and written good things about him, but say he controlled everything is just a bit too blunt. So this is why, if you look back at the mark scheme, it's moved down from that kind of detailed, sophisticated evaluation to basic and a bit blunt. It's a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So in summary then, for these short source evaluation questions, keep it under 5 minutes per question. We're not looking for some grand, lengthy evaluation of the nature of historians at this point. Quick, pointed responses. Read the question first, then read the source and pick out the bits you need. Try and do this as fast as you can. Maybe a good way of revising for this would simply just to pick a random passage from any of your source material. Bear in mind these two questions. What can it tell you? How reliable is it? And see how quickly you can just go through and reevaluate these different questions. Start your answers with some kind of judgment so we can learn a lot about them, a little about them. It is reliable, it is less reliable. Start with a judgment so it's clear that you've got it in from the very start. Then ideally make your point and use mini quotes to support your answer. Show that detailed reference to the source. And with both of these, try and work on a general rule of thumb of giving 3 points. It's not a perfect rule, but it helps. So there you have it, 5-mark depth study source questions. This has been focused on Cleopatra particularly and the specimen exam papers, but the general guides and rules apply for all different depth studies. As always, these tips are not set in stone. These are simply things I have found students found useful in the past. And to that end, I hope this has been useful. I hope it's not been too tedious. And until next time, goodbye.